Hi, I'm Rob.
And I'm Rob.
And this is Ask Rob and Rob.
Welcome to Ask Rob and Rob. Thank you for joining us on what is a very special Tuesday. A bit of a rarity this week's Ask Rob and Rob. I'll explain why in just a minute. But first, Rob, always have to start with a quick reminder of how people can send their questions in.
Yeah, we make it simple for you. All our contact bases are in one place. So if you want to phone, if you want to leave a message online, or you want to write in and potentially have your question answered in the Sunday Times each and every Sunday, well, you go to the one link. It's propertyhub.net/ask. Super simple. We've got you covered. Nearly all mediums. So however you like to participate in the pursuit of question answering, we've got you covered. So now you know how it's done. This week, as Rob's already alluded to, we have a special Ask Rob and Rob because we're breaking the rules because we're only having one question in. Well, actually, as you're about to hear, it's kind of more than one.
Hi, Rob and Rob. Allow me to introduce myself straight away before you conjure up some ridiculous name for me. This is Remco from the Netherlands speaking, and perhaps I am your most avid listener. I stumbled upon your podcast just before COVID hit, and I decided to binge listen to all the back catalog episodes. It took me a good 650 days, but it was worth it. We have just concluded the purchase of our second property thanks to your service. 5 years ago, I would have never expected to be where we are right now, and that's all down to you. So once again, a huge thank you. Now reached a point where the funds in our limited company are insufficient for a deposit, considering a generous contingency fund. As two wise podcast hosts have taught me, my wife and I want to keep the momentum going. The rental income from the two properties we currently have is not enough to save up for a deposit within a few years, assuming a minimum of 50k deposit. We prefer not to invest more of our own savings, so we have arrived at the point of taking out equity, and that's what my questions are about. And sorry in advance, I have multiple questions about this process, and hopefully I can get away with it. Firstly, about the value itself. The two properties we have must have some equity given that they came through you and you often manage to secure a discount. However, how do I find out the equity of the property? Is it through comparables, or do you need to send out a surveyor, or maybe something else? And then, what does the process of taking out equity actually entail? I hear you regularly talk about tapping into some equity, but I don't have a concrete outline of what happens then. And furthermore, if you take out equity, doesn't that affect your yield? Because borrowing more means you also have to pay more for your mortgage, right? So your rent still needs to provide a healthy margin for this, right? And finally, if you've borrowed more and the interest rates have risen by the time your term ends, you're in trouble. And because we're already overseas, we already face higher interest rates. Of course, when arranging mortgages, we involve mortgage brokers specialized in buy-to-let. But with the increased rates for overseas investors, is there still room to take out equity, or is it nearly an unattainable option? So my 4 questions are: how do we determine the property's equity, and what does the process of taking out equity involve? Does it affect your yield? And with higher overseas investor rates, is taking out equity still feasible? I am so sorry for bombarding you with all these questions. Hopefully they are straightforward enough to explain. Guys, once again, thank you so much for your education. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Remco. There is an embedded life lesson in here, which is sometimes it pays to be cheeky. Test your luck, ask more than one question, and it might just work out for you. And it's more likely to work out, in the case of this show at least, if you butter us up a bit first. Listen to every episode, you maniac. Right, let's dive into these 4 questions. So your first question was, how do I find out how much equity I have in the property? And the answer is, you can come to your idea of the answer yourself by looking at comparables. But then the actual answer will be decided by the valuer who your mortgage lender sends round. And those may not be the same numbers. You need to prepare yourself for that. And you'll both be using the same process. You mentioned comparables. So you'll be looking at other properties nearby that are very similar in type and have sold recently. Ideally, you have a couple of absolute rock solid comparables. So you can go, yep, they sold for that much. That is going to be the value of mine. The valuer will then hopefully go through the same process and come to the same answer and give you the valuation you want. Normally, though, that's not quite the case. You're never going to have something which is absolutely perfect as a comparable. So you're always going to be adding your interpretation on things. Okay, well, that's a bit further away and it's all for this much. Well, maybe it was 6 months ago, so you have to take it up or down a bit. You'll be doing that and naturally putting the best possible gloss on things. The valuer will be doing the opposite. They'll be looking to come to the most conservative or pessimistic estimate. But either way, it's worth doing this process yourself first, coming to your own estimate, maybe marking it down a bit to be cautious, and that will tell you if there is indeed enough equity in there to make it worth going through the process. So then your second question was about the process itself. And this has come up quite a few times, actually. This is something that we just tend to mention in passing in a throwaway line. But how does it actually work? How do you pull more money out? Well, let's assume that you're going to a different lender because that tends to be the case. So what you'll do is you'll go to them, probably via your broker, and apply for a remortgage. That will involve going through exactly the same process as you would when you're taking out a mortgage for the first time. You make the application, they send a valuer around to give their opinion, and then you end up with an offer. Eventually, by the time you wrap up the process, you have a lender who's willing to lend you more money than you need to pay off your existing mortgage. But you never end up with all that lovely money in your bank account at the same time. That would be a bit too risky. So what happens is your solicitor handles everything. They also contact your existing lender to get a final redemption statement, the balance of how much you need to repay, and let them know that you're planning to pay it off. And they will also handle taking the mortgage funds that come in from your new lender, paying off your old lender in full, and then whatever is left over, they release to you. So you then have extra cash in your bank account that you can go and do whatever you want with, which in this case is presumably investing in more property. Rob, 2 questions down. Over to you.
All right, Rob, let me pick this up because you've done a lot of the heavy lifting so far, but you've left me with relatively easy questions, fortunately. So your next question, Remco, was, does it affect your yields with higher overseas rates? Well, it impacts your yields whether you're overseas or in the UK. And it depends on which yields you're talking about. But ultimately, if you take equity out of the property, you're borrowing more. So therefore, the return you get each and every month, because your mortgage costs have gone up, will decrease. Now, there'll be stress tests, so there'll be a comfortable amount left. So you will still be making a profit each and every month after taking money out. The lenders won't allow you to do it otherwise. So that's fine. And this goes to everyone considering doing equity release, is are you relying on the rental income to increase your wealth or the capital growth? Now, if you're a long time listener to the podcast, which you are, Remco, you'll know that we focus on the capital growth. Now, that doesn't mean you have to, but that's what we do. So therefore, taking money out and putting it to work in another asset can be worthwhile. Something else to comment on the higher borrowing costs is that any money you take out, you need it to work at least as hard, if not harder, in another property. So what I mean by that is if you are borrowing at 5%, then that money that you now put to work, that money that you've extracted at a 5% borrowing rate, needs to be creating at least 5% for you in the new property, because then it will pay the borrowing costs of that money that you've taken out. And then if you get capital growth on top, you're winning. So if you match it up, then you're fine. If you can find something that provides a 6 or 7% return, which is very hard, but if you do, then your quid's in. You hopefully get both the capital growth and increased return. But I like to see it work at least as hard, because although we always aim for capital growth, it's not a guarantee. Yes, history shows us over the time it does kick in, but it's just a sensible thing to do. So if you're borrowing at 5, then make sure your return is at 5. And if you can't quite make the numbers work, maybe use part equity and part cash for your next purchase, and then you can get away with it. Okay, so that then finally leads us to, well, is it still feasible? Now, this has been quite a long answer, but there's been a lot of questions. But actually, this is a simple process. Do you have equity in the property? And Rob's explained to how you can determine whether you do or you don't. And if you do you pass the stress tests, and can you make your money work hard in another asset? So if you've got equity, you can pass the stress tests, and you've got another asset that you feel is going to add to your portfolio and deliver decent returns and potential capital growth, then yes, it is absolutely feasible. Overall, it's quite simple, requires a little bit of work, but then if you're growing your wealth by potentially quite a lot over the long term, maybe a bit of work is needed. I think it's a fair trade. But whatever you do, Remco, we wish you the very, very best of luck.
Well, there you go. 4 more questions answered on Ask Rob and Rob. We'll be back to do it all again next Tuesday. But before then, we will see you on Thursday for the Property Podcast. Look forward to it. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.